Greetings, my dear viewers. Welcome back to another Dungeons & Dragons character concept. Yes, that's right, I'm doing another one today. Yesterday I did the Herongon from The Wild Beyond the Witchlight. Today I'm going over Wild Beyond the Witchlight once more. Witchlight once more. I'm doing the second character race that you can play as thanks to this new adventure. The Fairy. Now, I only have one small complaint, and it's a small complaint because it's not really relevant. The Fairy is a small size instead of a tiny size. Now, like I said, it's not really a big deal. Small is alright, but when people think of Fairy, they think of Tinkerbell, which can be squashed underneath my thumb. So, when you think of small, obviously you think of halflings or kobolds. Fairies are the same size as them. So, that's my only real complaint. It's not it's not anything to scoff at, I guess, but that's just my thought. Anyway, the Fairy. Believe it or not, there is actually tons of lore for the Fairy. Not the Fairy specifically, but for the Fey race in general. Because according to the Wild Beyond the Witchlight sneak peek that we get thanks to Dungeons & Dragons Beyond, the fairies can actually have the same personality and even coloration to many fey creatures. So you can have the dark blue skin of a quickling, you could have the coloration of a pixie, whatever. I kind of like the ability where you have a spell. You get 3 spells: Druid Craft, Fairy Fire, and Enlarge Reduce. So you could technically play Tiny if you so desire, but it's only for a minute. So, the question is, how do we make a fairy character? Well, that's what I'm going to be doing today as per this series, character concept. We take a look at each race, go over the lore, and match a background and class to it. Well, backgrounds and classes. Now, for our backgrounds, the possible backgrounds that a fairy could have, based on the lore that we get, are the Charlatan, the Far Traveler, the Faction Agent, because there are a couple of factions that you need to know of when you're going over the Feywild. Could be a noble, a soldier, or a spy. For classes, the most common ones that I could think of are Druid, Fighter, Rogue, and Warlock. Now, let's go ahead and take a deeper dive into these classes and see which subclasses would best fit a fairy. We'll start off with Barbarian with the Path of Wild Magic, and only because of the connection to the Feywild. This is probably the least likely class that you would pick for your fairy, but it's still an option that is plausible, but not the most relevant. The Bard is actually a more relevant class because of how tricky a Bard can be and how tricky fairies and the Fae can be. The colleges that you'd most likely pick are Glamour, because once again, your connection to the Feywild, and Whispers. This is kind of like the criminal bards, which, because of the 2 main factions, if I can remember how to pronounce them, I think it's the Salih and the Untitled. I don't remember how to pronounce them or how they're even spelled, but those are the two factions that you need to be aware of. Basically, good Fey, kind of, and evil Fey, kind of. Just like the Feywild, it's kind of tricky to deduce what is good and what is evil. It's kind of like in real life. If you were to go to a certain church, you would see good church members, and you would see not so good church members. Anyway, moving on, we are going with Cleric. Once again, there's not really any gods to speak of, except for the Archfey. So some people might just use the Cleric as an excuse for following the ideas of their domain. Nature and trickery, to be more precise, because that's the Feywild. Next is Druid. Obviously, you'd be going with the Circle of Dreams because of your connection to the Feywild. Obviously. Also, the Circle of Spores. This is going off of the mushroom rings, which are symbols of fairies. So yeah, Circle of Spores. Fighter is next. This is another one that's not likely, but is definitely plausible. The archetypes that would be available for a fairy would be the Arcane Archer because of the Ladron, Eldritch Knight, and the Banneret. Next up is Paladin. This is a little bit more likely than the Fighter, but still not exactly likely. But if you do have a Fairy Paladin, I would recommend the Oath of Ancients or the Oath of the Watchers. Now for the Ranger, this one is pretty likely, just as likely as the Druid. For your Conclaves, the Fey Wanderer, definitely, because Feywild, once again, and Gloomstalker. This is for that other type of faction, the Untitled, or however it's pronounced. Those who follow the Queen of, I think it was Night and Darkness? I don't remember. Either way, Gloomstalker is for that particular Fey faction. Next is Rogue. Arcane Trickster, definitely. Scout and Thief. These are definitely very likely for a fairy, especially if you're not particularly fond of using magic that often. So definitely go with the Scout or the Thief. Arcane Trickster is just more of a flavor thing. Fairies are very tricky and like pulling pranks. Sorcerer of the wild magic origin is definitely likely, though I think this is more for a fairy in the material plane rather than in the Feywild. Though I still would consider it. Warlock of the Archfey is definitely going to be one of the more common classes to choose, just because of the connection to the two factions in the Feywild. I think the good Archfey is called Tatiana. Can't quite remember. But those two faction leaders, the Archfey, are definitely considerable and most likely the most common to pick for a fairy, at least as far as a warlock goes. And finally, wizard. This is actually less likely than a warlock, but still up for consideration. I would say this is less likely than a ranger. For your wizard schools, I would pick enchantment, illusion, or onomancy. Once again, names are kind of important, and in the Feywild, you could quite easily use that to your advantage, especially with a fairy. Being able to use somebody's name against them. Holy cow. It is Unearthed Arcana, so this is more of a DM's discretion. But, in either case, still a good class to use. Well, I'm afraid that's all the time I have for you today, my dear viewers. I do hope you have enjoyed. If you are looking for more content like this, I've got the Harangon from yesterday, and tomorrow we're going to be back on track with the character concepts and going over the Hexblood. But until then, this has been Drayhon, and I am offline.